Good morning. Let's get straight to markets.
Take a look at the impact for the indices.
Factual. Succinct. All you need to know before your trading day starts. Subscribe to our newsletter, CNBC's Daily Open.
Welcome to Beyond the Valley, a CNBC tech podcast with Arjun Kharpal and Tom Chitty.
Beyond the Valley.
Since the start of the year, Arjun has travelled around Europe speaking to the leaders and innovators in tech. And now we're going to dig a little deeper. Over the next few weeks, we'll find out what's happening in some of Europe's key tech hubs with the help of a special guest who will help us understand its inner workings and the challenges it may face. This week, we start with the UK.
Beyond the Valley.
Arjun, before we introduce our guest, it was your suggestion to do this series. What do you hope our listeners will learn from it?
Are you saying if it goes badly, it's my suggestion?
You're to blame.
Okay, fine.
Absolutely.
I'll take that. If I'm hoping that we sort of give an insight into what's going on in the world of tech in various parts of Europe, because each region has its own strengths, its own weaknesses, and more recently with the sort of explosion of AI we've spoken about so much, there's been some interesting things happening in and around the European tech scene as well.
Do you think it's a time where it seems very excitable?
The founders and CEOs I've spoken to, I've always asked them this question. Europe pretty much lost out on the internet age to the big US tech giants. Is this the time Europe gets a chance to catch up? And they're all very, of course, as you'd expect, very excited. This is a chance Europe can pull out some pretty big companies, but that's the vibe that I'm getting right now.
Okay, let me introduce our special guest. Sanjot Malhi is a partner at venture capital fund Northzone. He's been there for a year and a half. And I'm going to get you, Sanjot, to explain what Northzone specialises in, where its key focus is. But first, I want to find out about your former career as a professional athlete, having played football professionally as well as club-level cricket. Sanjot, talk us through it.
Yeah, so, most of my childhood was centred around sports. Not around technology or anything of the sort. So, yeah, I played club cricket. So I grew up in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. I was born in India, grew up in the Netherlands. I played club cricket. I grew up in The Hague, so I was captain of the Hague Cricket Club. The Netherlands, as you know, is not a cricket major, so that it's not such a big deal. But then I played football the most, soccer. And I played club in the Netherlands, and then I went back and played the national championship in India.
Wow, yeah, incredible.
So this is a great summer of sport for you. We've got the Euros. We've got the 2020 Cricket World Cup on right now.
Yeah, you're going to be very conflicted where your loyalties lie.
I think in cricket, it's obviously India. But
Arjun's happy to have. Look at him nodding. For our listeners, that was the most aggressive nod you've made on this podcast.
You know me. I just enjoy the sport. If it's England v India, I just enjoy it for what it is, and
enjoy good cricket.
Yeah. All right. Wow. Okay. I felt ganged up on it.
Yeah. Well, for the football, I have a split allegiance between the Netherlands and England, depending on who wins.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good to have this because you can sort of be a winner a lot.
Yeah, you just pick and choose.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, bit of housekeeping. If you haven't already, for our listeners, you can subscribe to the Beyond the Valley weekly newsletter. Head to cnbc.com/Beyond the Valley. Click on the subscribe button and you'll get a newsletter every Friday with all the best international tech stories from CNBC. And if you want to contact Arjun and I or have a question about a past episode or this episode, then email us at beyondthevalley@cnbc.com. Okay, before we get into it, we have, of course, got to do Stat of the Week. It's not that complicated. Arjun will come up with a stat and we have to try and guess what that stat refers to. It will be related to what we're talking about in this episode. So
£953.7 million. That's the stat this week.
Okay. And it's you versus me. And you love sports, so this competitive edge is, you're going to love it. It's great. You look so excited. Okay, Sanjot, first an easy question to start off. If you could rank Europe's tech hubs, what would be your top three?
Yeah, so I tend to be quite numbers driven. So my top three would be the UK, Germany, and France, probably in that order.
Okay.
And the reason is, if you look at 2023's venture funding landscape, the UK was around 23 billion in VC funding, and the next three combined in Europe are about equal to that. So, and that's Germany, France, and Sweden in that order.
Okay. We have heard, read last couple of days that that France is coming to take the UK's crown. I mean, are we? Is that just hyperbole? Is that scaremongering for us Brits?
Look, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. Zero-sum headlines are great because they get eyeballs. If you pit people against each other, it doesn't need to be, right? Innovation is unlimited if you do it right. So I don't think crowns have to be taken from one another. I think both can be great tech hubs, and they hopefully will be if you look at the early signs.
Okay, before we get into the meat of the episode, talk us through Northzone.
Yeah.
What does Northzone do?
Yeah, Northzone's one of Europe's oldest venture funds. So we've been around about 3 decades, one of the first in Europe to do Silicon Valley-style venture investing. In those 3 decades, we've raised about 13 funds, managed between 3 and 4 billion in assets. We've been early investors in many, many category-defining companies, the likes of Spotify, Klarna, Personio, iZettle, and Spring Health in the US. Like I said, we started in Europe, in the Nordics. We've expanded sort of organically with the European ecosystem, which I'm sure we'll speak about. So we have offices now in London, Stockholm, Amsterdam, and Berlin, but also in the US and New York. So we're very much global, multi-stage, started with venture, now do growth and late stage, which is what I lead for the firm.
Okay, brilliant. And we've talked a little bit about where the UK is within Europe. Mm-hmm. Sounds like it's number one. Where is the UK globally, though? Because I imagine it's not number one.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Just to be blunt.
Yeah. So I've had the pleasure of now having worked and invested across North America, Asia, and Europe. If you look at the great tech hubs around the world, San Francisco, Beijing are up there. Just if you look at the sort of 1,200, 1,300 unicorns around the world, the vast majority are between those two cities, really. So it's very, very concentrated. And then you have Tel Aviv, Bangalore, Southeast Asia, and LATAM now coming up as well, and Europe, of course. Europe has about 160-odd unicorns. And the biggest hub within that being the UK with 50 or 60. So to answer your question, no, it's not the biggest in the world, but it's not insignificant, right? If you look at it, and things are trending, broadly speaking, in the right direction. If you look at the capital, the quality of the founders, and really even outcomes in terms of companies being created.
Sanjot, just back to the UK, in the 2010s, mid-2010s, it was all about fintech. People said, look, London in particular is a financial hub, but it's got that sort of history. On top of that, it's got good pools of capital. At that time, it was part of the European Union, so access to the single market. What now, as you look at it in 2024, are London or the UK more broadly strengths in tech?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most tech hubs tend to develop around industries where they have incumbent advantages, and the London for obvious reasons has had that in financial services, like you said. So it's not surprising that fintech was the first sort of starting ground for tech activity. But going back to my earlier point about global hubs, if you look at most of these global hubs, they develop in similar manners. So the first sort of wave of innovation comes around whatever's most natural, whatever's been done for the longest time. Here it's financial services. But once you have these large companies here, the likes of Klarna and Monzo and others that have come out of that wave, you get a second generation of entrepreneurs who then tend to solve issues that they faced. Because now they've grown up in these tech environments, and so they're facing very different issues to the first generation. And so I think going forward, you'll see much more sort of tech-heavy, deeper tech kind of problems being solved, and that'll probably reflect in that makeup of the verticals.
And what's happening with venture funding here? Is the recovery taking hold in the early part of 2024 in the first half at the moment, or is there still a bit of caution given some of the broader macroeconomic headwinds? Of course, in the UK, we have an election upcoming too.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I would say 2022 was probably the worst of this cycle, where we kind of peaked. I mean, I was at a firm that did both public and private investing. So, it was a good vantage point to see both sides of the equation. And things really went, downhill at the end of 21 and early 22. And it stayed pretty bleak for most of that year. But if you go back to 23, we're already seeing growth in terms of funding. So, which is very good to see, right? You're seeing sort of early signs of the recovery. I think the UK is up 30-40% year on year. France is up the most, to your point, almost 50%. So I think there are early signs of the recovery. 24, the numbers remain to be seen, but anecdotally, you feel it when you look around, and there's big rounds happening, the likes of Wave, even in the UK, right? So I think there's early signs of it, and we've had an IPO today, which is kind of a big milestone. So I think things are trending in the right direction.
What are the thematics then, in terms of that are prominent at the moment for you as you look at the investment landscape in the UK?
Yeah, so we tend to be very, very bottoms-up sort of fundamentals-driven investor, especially on the later side, which is what I do. So we look for real problems being solved, frankly. And if you look at the big trends, AI is a big one. But for me, AI only matters if you're solving a real problem. AI for the sake of AI is not very interesting. So, but it'll remain a big trend. And then, of course, you have software as always, but I think we're increasingly seeing a lot more hardware as well in sort of real-world problems. And I've lately been seeing even quantum, especially out of the UK, which is really fascinating.
When you talk about the 2022 obviously being a bad year, let's go even further back to 2016 and Brexit. How has, if at all, Brexit affected the UK tech scene?
Yeah, so if you think about it, what creates a tech hub? I think the most important and fundamental thing is talent. And then there's capital, and then there's sort of regulation and so on, things that flow from there. But really, it's about the talent that is where it starts. And so, I think the biggest thing it's affected is the inflow of high quality talent. There are bigger barriers, right, to people coming in and working in the UK because of Brexit. I think the UK has had very good policies in terms of visas being more available and streamlining visa processes, especially for tech workers and so on. But I do think that there's a lot more that can be done to sort of streamline that and make it more accessible, and therefore a more thriving sort of tech environment.
Are there other challenges at the moment as you see them to the UK tech landscape? Is it around, for example, some of the lingering issues from Brexit, or is it around government policy or anything like that?
Yeah, this is probably a fairly boring answer, but I think one of the best things a great government can do is create just an enabling environment for innovation, and then get out of the way. Because sometimes one mistakes activity for productivity, and there's almost a political need to be active and create regulation when it's not necessary. So I think it's important to protect the public, and so to that extent, regulation is important. But beyond that, I think it's really about creating an environment that lowers the hurdles for talent, capital inflow, company formation, failure, clear sort of bankruptcy laws and things like that. So that sort of virtuous cycle that enables people to start up and create new companies, I think is ultimately what is required.
So are you suggesting at this point, Sanjot, there's a bit too much regulation in certain areas in the UK? I mean, if so, where are... Because I remember sort of going back to those days when we were talking about the fintech boom in London, the FCA at that point was seen as quite a forward-thinking regulator. They created the sandboxes and various other things that allowed firms to experiment with a lot of financial technology products. And they were quite well regarded. I haven't necessarily heard the same about the modern day FCA. And also, there's a lot of criticism of the the Competition and Markets Authority and how aggressive they've been on something. So when you talk about the regulatory front, when you talk on that, is there something at the moment in the UK that could be improved, or you feel it's too burdensome?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm really no expert in regulation, so I'll refrain from commenting on specific sort of political policies. But generally speaking, if you look at Europe, it has a history of creating more onerous regulation than some of the other tech hubs, namely the US, which is far more sort of laissez-faire in many ways, which enables innovation. So that's, I guess, where my point is coming from. And I think the UK has traditionally been part of that sort of European ecosystem. I think governments have gotten that, including the present government, and recognize the need to create a more streamlined environment. But if I'm being honest, it's still the action has been missing behind that sort of political fervor, if you will, to your point. We haven't seen enough to create that environment. I think both parties have already announced that they'll have an AI policy. I still don't know what that means, but it remains to be seen what that entails, right?
And we're recording this on Tuesday, the 11th of June, just to be clear. And this morning we had quite a big IPO, which you covered extensively, Arjun. When it comes to IPOs in the UK, pretty underwhelming of late. How big was that IPO? Arjun, talk through the listeners what happened this morning.
It was I walked into the London Stock Exchange. There was confetti everywhere. The team at Raspberry Pi, this is the company you're referring to, a British computing startup, been around since 2012, selling these single board computers, initially started for hobbyists, really. Now they say their biggest market is industrial uses. But that was, it's a pretty small IPO. I think when you look at tech IPOs more broadly, particularly if you look across the pond to the US, it's a pretty small IPO. I think the valuation in the end was just north of £500 million, so it hasn't even hit sort of $1 billion. But it was obviously a big deal for London, which, as you mentioned, has just had a dearth of IPOs, and particularly in the tech sector. So there was a lot of excitement around it. The CEO of the London Stock Exchange was around, all the executives. So there's a lot of excitement, big party. I was on the roof. Had a great view.
Did you get? But you weren't under the confetti when it all came.
No, I heard it pop off. No. I walked and then I wasn't allowed in that area.
Nice.
Subscribe to the Squawkbox Europe Express podcast. Join Steve, Karen, and myself, Arabile, in unscripted and dynamic debate around the day's top stories with first and exclusive interviews of the best in business and global newsmakers, original points of view, and instant analysis of the latest business news and key market themes. Get set for the day ahead. Squawkbox Europe Express podcast, now available on Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Podcasts.
So I suppose just talking about that, I mean, is it something that we should be taking note of? Is it a huge boost, or should we just, temper our excitement?
Yeah, so I think it's more symbolic than anything else. Like Arjun mentioned, it's not big. It's if a unicorn were to go public, it's not even hit that scale. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly sort of mid-sized to small IPO, but it is symbolic. It is tech. It is in London, and we haven't seen many of those. If you think about sort of IPOs and capital markets, they're in some ways the ultimate network effect businesses, right? You need, it's a little bit of a cold start problem. You need high quality business to want to list. A. B, you need deep-pocketed investors who can deploy large sums of permanent capital. And then third, you need really intelligent investors in those specific sectors, in this case tech, that understand the nuances of that. The UK has been missing all three, and therein lies the issue. And
how does it reverse that then? How does it buck the trend?
Yeah, and that's why I said it's a little bit of a cold start problem. So it has to start somewhere. I reckon it'll start with somebody that's large, a company choosing to go public here for whatever reason that might be. It might be political, it might be something else, and that kickstarts other things in that ecosystem, because the big mutual funds are all here. Fidelity's here, and Franklin Templeton, they're all here. It's just that they haven't had an opportunity to deploy large sums of capital in very high quality companies. Maybe it could be one of the Chinese like Shein listing here, and that could potentially be a good effect for the...
I have a ton of questions. First one, how big a snub was the Arm IPO in the end. This is a British company.
Yeah.
And, there's questions whether the British government back in 2016 should have even allowed this company to be sold. I was in the room at the press conference at the time. Masayoshi Son there, Simon Seeger's the arms, and this company went. This is one of the most critical semiconductor firms in the world. And now they're listing in the US. That was a big blow, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a blow, but it's also somewhat symptomatic of what I just said, right? So it doesn't necessarily surprise you. Also, it's Japanese owned. Right, it's not really UK owned. It may have been started here, but it's owned by Masa, and Masa made the call to list in the US, and perhaps with good reason, because like I said, the access to that quality of capital doesn't exist. But I think somebody has to make that leap, and the rest follows. It may not be Arm, because again, SoftBank has its own problems. So they're protecting their downside more than anything else at that point, and so they were taking the safer option. But it'll take somebody to sort of make that leap, and I think somebody will.
I know talking about rules is boring, but sometimes it's important. The London Stock Exchange, in particular, and the regulation around listing in the UK has been criticised quite heavily by tech companies around things like founder dual class shares.
Yes.
One of the things that struck me this morning when I was covering the IPO was today, Tuesday, the 11th of June, 2024, is conditional listing of Raspberry Pi. So only institutional investors effectively can buy up shares, and then it goes on to properly trade 3 days later on Friday for the retail investors. At this point, we had a 30% pop on the price. The retail investors are sitting there going, well, I've missed out that whole chunk if it continues to go up. Those kind of things, I think, really great tech founders and CEOs of larger companies when they look to list here, right? So it's an issue with a whole reform of listing rules here in the UK, which needs to be carried out, right?
Yeah, I think it is a bit of that. Most stock exchanges lag behind the US in terms of listing rules, to your point. The US is definitely the most evolved. They're more accommodating of sort of venture-funded companies, if you will. Again, going back to the global landscape, so the same used to be said of China if you went back a decade. The same used to be said of India 5 years ago. Literally the same thing. And now people are talking about non-Indian companies listing in India because that stock exchange is so valuable and so attractive. What changed? One, the Indian government said loss-making companies can now list, which was never the case. And then second, somebody just made the leap and said, we're going to go list. And then the rest followed. I think it'll be a bit of both in the UK as well, where it'll take a government that changes a couple of things, a couple of the big things that you mentioned, and then somebody listing, and the rest will fall in place.
I know it's not your key area with Northzone, with your role at Northzone, but startups in the UK, we hear a lot that like the environment isn't particularly supportive, at least from the government, UK government, and that they could be doing more. That's obviously their take on it. Where do you see the UK government on that front?
Yeah, I think it goes back a little bit to sort of the people aspect. I think that is probably the biggest hurdle here in terms of creating employment. So now the UK startup scene employs about 1.8 million people. So it's not immaterial. It's significant, and that's gone up about 4x since 2018. So the growth is really material. People used to say that there's no vote bank in tech, and so politicians didn't care about tech as much. I don't think that's the case anymore. So I think people, the sort of political class is taking notice of that. And to your point, I think what can specifically change is sort of employability laws, the ability to attract more talent, retain more talent, make it much more streamlined to create option pools, award people with equity, and the treatment of that equity should be at par with public equities. All of those things, I think, have to fall in place for that ecosystem to work. So in short, I think it's really about the people aspect more than anything else.
Sanjot, one of the things that struck me is I want to talk about the sort of government's role. One thing that struck me when I visited France, in particular when you look at Vivatech, it's a big show, we know that, but the French government ministers, and even Macron himself, the president, is in attendance. Just this past few weeks ago, he gathered a bunch of CEOs from technology companies and leaders together. And whilst a lot of this, can be seen to be perhaps showboating, there is a genuine feeling that actually the government is throwing their full weight behind the force of France's tech sector. And I don't think it's any surprise you've got companies like Mistral and H&, et cetera, raising large sums and being kind of thrust into the spotlight. That the UK, just again, from looking from the outside, feels like it wants to talk about tech. It wants to say we're a leader in crypto, we're a leader in AI, we're a leader in all these areas. But the action and that kind of level of support hasn't felt there. Is that an accurate reflection in your point of view? Does the UK government need to be doing more in a similar vein to what the French are doing at the moment?
So I think the correlation is certainly there. If you have a tech-forward leader who's the head of state or head of government, I think it certainly helps, right? It's been the case around the world again, wherever you look, China, India, the US, and Europe, now in France. And I think Emmanuel Macron is definitely somebody who is very tech-forward and forward-leaning on technology. It feels like the Prime Minister here is as well. There's obviously different sort of, I guess, political complexities in every system that hold different leaders back. But ultimately, you want a tech ecosystem that is removed from politics, right? So no single individual, even if they happen to be the head of state, should be able to move the needle that much, ideally speaking, right? In the US, if you look at San Francisco, it doesn't matter who the president is. They have built AI, they have built all sorts of innovation, they have all funding flowing, and that's the ultimate state that you want to arrive at. But yeah, I think France has done a really great job, but at the same time, it is today, it's still very, very early days, right? I mean, still there's only one company that everyone mentions when you think of it's just Mistral that everyone's talking about. So the repeatability of that remains to be seen, and if you look, markets are down in France today because of the European election and the results there as well. So you don't know what happens, but ultimately you want a tech ecosystem that is removed from politics, but yet you need a government that is supportive.
That's so hard these days, though. Tech and politics are intertwined. You look at the battle between China and the US over various technologies from AI to semiconductors. It's very difficult these days for that to happen. It almost as if governments need to or feel the need to be involved in particular areas, I guess, where they see strategic importance, whether it's around semiconductors and military applications, AI, right? And so it's those areas they're getting involved in, but you don't necessarily want them to be involved in some of these other areas.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the strategic elements remain and will always remain, right? And that some of the geopolitics is becoming more complicated with the Middle East and so on, and Ukraine. So that is understandable. But for the rest of it, it shouldn't require so much of the government's heavy lift to do it. Ideally, what the government should create is fostering the innovation, which is education, the laws that enable company creation and bankruptcy. They encourage FDI. Those are the fundamental things, the boring stuff that the government needs to do. But I think the problem with democracy, which we all love, is that it is prone to populism, right? And so they tend to go towards what makes for the best headlines, and FDI rules don't really make for great headlines.
Well, I just last question from me. Looking ahead now for the UK tech scene, where do you think they could sort of hang their jacket on? What area of tech do you think the UK, that's the area they should be aiming to be a real leader in?
I think several things. AI, definitely. Again, going back to sort of the education hubs, I think the UK has amongst the best technical education institutes in the world. So AI and software in general, for sure. I think forward-leaning, we will see quantum will create a massive leap. And I think the UK will be a very, very important hub in that. And we're seeing early signs of that. And then even hardware, because of that sort of deep tech. Understanding and education, and even climate tech. I would say those four are probably the ones that come to mind.
And just the last one for me, Sanjot, just because you mentioned AI and the topic du jour, DeepMind.
Yes.
is the company everyone talks about when they talk about UK's AI scene. That's obviously owned by an American firm, Alphabet, Google at this point in time. Does the UK have what it takes, in your view, to produce a global AI giant?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, because it affects my life. But but look, I mean, we're in the infancy of AI, right? And we forget that it's literally sort of day zero of what the new version of generative AI looks like, and if you break it up, and this is somewhat reductive, if you break it up into sort of the four big buckets of AI, number one is hardware, closest to the metal, which is the chips, and we've seen NVIDIA rally. The second is the large language models, which is the Mistrals and Llamas of the world. Then I think there will be an infrastructure software layer built around that, the likes of Snowflake for specifically AI. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, the application layer. Because we all speak about AI, but it's not as prevalent in our lives and businesses as it should be yet. So there will be an application layer developing. The reason I'm saying all of this is because we are so focused on step 1 and 2 today, because that's all we see. Steps 3 and 4, I think, is where the ultimate value capture will lie, and I think the UK has as good a chance as any to build something there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll leave it there. But before we finish, we have, of course, got to do Stat of the Week. Oh, have you been thinking about it? Because you seem very focused on the podcast, but you should have really been thinking about Stat of the Week.
I think Sanjot knows the answer. I think he knows the answer. I think your time's over,
I'm done.
Tom.
You're done.
You're done.
So much pressure.
Yeah.
Wait, should I go first? If you think
£953.7 million is the stat.
Okay, I'll go first, because if I'm going to be wrong, then I don't want to just copy your answer.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with the amount of VC funding in UK tech startups for 2025.
No.
Okay.
The next year? Oh.
For next year.
Wow.
That's
bold.
Forecast.
Yeah.
I like it, Tom.
I would say that is the amount of funding in UK AI startups.
No. I was wrong. Oh. Should we... it relates... little hint.
Oh,
it relates to last year.
Okay.
And it relates... I'll just say the phrase Raspberry Pi. Rooftop of the London Stock Exchange. The Stock Exchange. IPO.
The amount... The IPOs from...
the IPO money raised from IPOs last year.
There we go. Sanjot's got it.
I did concede. I mean, I was about to say the answer, and you just talked over me.
Yeah.
It was indeed the amount raised via IPOs in the UK in 2023, down 40%.
Wow.
From 2022, in which issuers raised £1.6 billion.
Wow.
What a happy note to end on.
Yeah. We like to end it on
that's all we've got time
That might
for.
change.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Let's
wrap
it up there before
we're only halfway through.
depress Sanjot anymore.
Yeah, won't ever come back.
Sanjot, thank you very much for joining us on Beyond the Valley. That's it for this episode. But before we go, please follow and subscribe to the show and rate us if you'd like. Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Sanjot.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week for another episode of Beyond the Valley. Goodbye.
Beyond the Valley.